The news broke like a thunderclap. In the early hours of 23 September 2025, three flags were raised not in surrender but in defiance. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger tore their names from the roster of the International Criminal Court. They did not step back politely. They slammed the door shut and declared The Hague for what they believed it always was, a colonial courtroom dressed as justice. For more than 2 decades, the court in Europe claimed universality, yet its hammer seemed to fall almost exclusively on Africa. Presidents from Kampala to Nairobi were paraded before the world, while Washington, London, and Paris remained untouchable. It was a script Africans knew too well. One law for the strong, another for the weak. And now the Sahel has said enough. These are not stable democracies enjoying peace, but nations scarred by war, insurgency, and upheaval. Their withdrawal is not a gesture of convenience. It is an act of rebellion. It is sovereignty spoken aloud. Do not look away. What comes next may change how we read the map. Subscribe and keep watching. It was not a whisper in the corridors of diplomacy. It was a thunderclap heard across continents. On 23 September 2025, the military-led governments of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger stood shoulder to shoulder and announced their immediate withdrawal from the International Criminal Court. No committees, no consultations, no cautious timelines, only a clean break. The words were sharp as steel. The ICC was, in their eyes, nothing more than a neo-colonial tool. The symbolism of this decision cannot be overstated. For years, the ICC had loomed over African leadership like a distant sword. It had been invoked as the arbiter of justice, yet perceived in many capitals as an instrument of selective punishment. Now, in one coordinated move, the Sahel's leaders cut that thread and refused the court's jurisdiction. They were no longer subjects of its scrutiny. They declared themselves authors of their own justice. To understand why this moment reverberated so loudly, we must revisit the fragile context in which it unfolded. These were not nations celebrating stability. They were lands scarred by insurgency, where villages burn at night, where children are pressed into militias, and where governments rise and fall through the force of arms. Between 2020 and 2023, successive coups had toppled civilian administrations in Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey. The new rulers were not born of parliaments but of battlefields. They came with the weight of guns, with the scars of ambushes, with comrades buried in shallow graves across the Sahel. It is in this crucible of fire that their rejection of the ICC gains meaning. For them, sovereignty is not an academic debate. It is survival. Every investigation threatened their armies, the very soldiers who defend towns and borders against armed groups. To hand over commanders to The Hague was, in their eyes, to criminalize the defense of their homeland. And so rather than live under that shadow, they stepped outside of it. The announcement itself was delivered with military precision. No ambiguity, no hedging. A joint communiqué was released in the early hours, and its language carried the certainty of a battlefield order. They accused the ICC of being a tool of neo-colonial repression and affirmed that African justice must no longer be dictated from European capitals. To many observers, this was more than a withdrawal. It was a declaration of rebellion, not only against the court, but against an entire system that had long claimed universality while practicing selectivity. Images of black-robed judges in The Hague deciding who among Africans was guilty and who was not had become a symbol of inequality. The leaders of Washington, Moscow, Beijing, and Paris never feared those summons. Yet African presidents, generals, and rebels were paraded as trophies of international morality. The Sahel's declaration sought to torch that illusion once and for all. But what makes this moment so electrifying is not only its audacity, but its potential consequences. With one act, 3 of Africa's most embattled nations have challenged the legitimacy of a global institution. They have dared to ask a question that international law has long evaded. If justice is truly universal, why does it appear to be enforced only where power is weakest? The immediate shock was immense. Diplomats in Brussels and Washington scrambled to draft responses. Legal scholars argued about precedents. Human rights advocates feared for the fate of victims in war-torn Sahel provinces. Yet beneath the debate, one truth rang clear. The aura of inevitability that once cloaked the ICC had been pierced. For the citizens of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, this moment was painted not in the language of statutes, but in the language of defiance. It was about reclaiming dignity. It was about saying that African blood would no longer be measured differently from Western blood. And for soldiers patrolling dusty roads under the Sahel sun, it was reassurance that their struggles would not be judged in distant courtrooms, but within the soil they defend. This act, bold as it was, marked not only a legal rupture, but also a psychological one. It was a message to every African watching. Sovereignty is not a gift granted by treaties. It is a choice, even in the face of immense pressure. It is a path carved not by waiting for permission, but by seizing the right to decide. And yet, as the dust settled on that September morning, one question began to echo louder than the announcement itself. This was not just a statement of law, it was a declaration of rebellion. What would it really mean for Africa and for the world? The reverberations of that declaration did not stop at the borders of the Sahel. They traveled to Brussels, to Washington, to Paris, shaking diplomatic circles that had grown accustomed to Africa's quiet compliance. The withdrawal was not framed as a bureaucratic adjustment. It was an act of rebellion, and rebellions always carry consequences. Reactions came swiftly. European officials expressed concern about victims being denied justice. Legal commentators warned that war crimes might now go unpunished. Human rights organizations lamented a retreat from accountability. Yet behind these statements was a tremor of fear, the fear that a precedent had been set. If Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger could walk out, what stopped others from following? What would happen if the African Union, which had long criticized the ICC for its bias, chose to bless a continental exodus? That fear was not unfounded. The African Union had already been simmering with frustration for over a decade. In 2016, Burundi became the first nation to formally leave the ICC, accusing it of anti-African bias. South Africa nearly followed suit before domestic courts halted the move. Kenya openly defied the court when its president and deputy were indicted, portraying the process as an affront to national sovereignty. The Sahel's decision, therefore, did not appear as an isolated storm. It looked like the crack that might open the dam. Diplomats in Western capitals understood this. They realized that the ICC's credibility was already fragile on the continent. For years, African leaders had accused the court of hunting Africans while sparing the powerful elsewhere. Of the first 30 individuals indicted by the ICC, nearly all were African. Omar al-Bashir of Sudan was dragged through the international spotlight, while George W. Bush and Tony Blair never faced even the shadow of a summons for Iraq. Nicolas Sarkozy was not called to answer for Libya, nor Emmanuel Macron for France's actions in the Sahel. To Africans, the imbalance was glaring, and the withdrawal by the Sahel trio merely gave voice to a sentiment long whispered across the continent. Justice in The Hague was selective. This selectivity was not only about leaders. It extended to history itself. The ICC never examined the colonial crimes of France and Rwanda, of Belgium and Congo, of Britain and Kenya. Generations of pain and massacre were left untouched, while newer African conflicts were dissected under the bright lights of European courts. To many Africans, this was not impartial justice. It was historical amnesia dressed as law. The court's silence on these atrocities became louder than its prosecutions. Thus, when the Sahel states delivered their announcement with military precision, they were not merely protecting their current leadership. They were amplifying decades of grievance. They transformed the ICC from a judge into a defendant accused in the court of African public opinion. The Western media narrative, predictably, was one of alarm. Outlets emphasized the dangers of impunity, painting the juntas as self-interested rulers, shielding themselves from accountability. But in the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, a different story was told. Crowds saw not an escape from justice, but a stand for dignity. Social media filled with messages celebrating sovereignty. For many citizens, especially those who had lost trust in international promises, the withdrawal was less about shielding elites and more about reclaiming agency. This divergence in perception is crucial. Where Western capitals saw risk, ordinary Africans saw resistance. Where human rights organizations saw retreat, Sahel citizens saw renewal. And it is in this clash of interpretations that the true drama unfolds. At the heart of the storm was a question bigger than law. Could Africa continue to accept a system where its leaders were judged by standards that exempted the powerful? Could nations fighting existential battles against insurgencies afford to allow distant courts to criminalize their soldiers? And perhaps most dangerously for the West, if 3 nations dared to leave, who might be next? The symbolism spread beyond the Sahel. In East Africa, leaders who had long criticized the ICC watched closely. In North Africa, where colonial scars remain raw, the move resonated as an act of long-delayed defiance. Across the continent, the ICC's authority began to look less inevitable, more negotiable. The reaction of global powers mirrored their geopolitical anxieties. The United States, which itself never ratified the Rome Statute, urged the Sahel states to reconsider. The European Union warned of consequences for victims of atrocities, yet the irony was glaring. Washington had kept itself immune from the court's reach while urging Africans to submit. To many Africans, this hypocrisy only reinforced the righteousness of the withdrawal. In this clash of perspectives, the announcement of September 23rd became more than a legal maneuver. It became a test of wills, between African sovereignty and Western universality, between local realities and global narratives, between rebellion and order. And hovering over it all was a chilling possibility. If 3 could leave today, what stops 5 tomorrow? The decision to sever ties with the International Criminal Court did not unfold in a vacuum. Its ripples moved through the homes, markets, and battlefields of the Sahel. For Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the question was not only what the world thought of them, but how their people would live with the consequences. For ordinary citizens, the announcement carried a symbolic weight far greater than its legal implications. In the displaced persons camps of northern Burkina Faso, in the besieged villages of central Mali, and along the borderlands of Niger where militias roam freely, the words spoken in September 2025 translated into a message of ownership. Our fate will not be decided in foreign chambers. For communities that have lived for years under the shadow of war, this assertion of dignity resonated deeply. It was less about statutes, more about survival. But sovereignty has its price. By withdrawing from the ICC, the Sahel states knowingly stepped into diplomatic isolation. Human rights organizations warned of sanctions, while European governments hinted that aid flows could be reconsidered. For countries already balancing on the edge of humanitarian crises, such threats carried weight. Burkina Faso relies heavily on international support for food security. Mali's economy has been strained by years of conflict. Niger, one of the poorest nations in the world, depends on external partners for infrastructure and health. To risk alienating donors was to gamble with the welfare of millions. Yet the juntas made their wager. Their reasoning was blunt. Aid tied to conditions was no longer worth the cost of subordination. To them, external funds were shackles disguised as gifts. Better to struggle with empty coffers than to live with empty sovereignty. This calculation transformed the withdrawal from a legal maneuver into a political manifesto, dignity above dependency. Domestically, the move strengthened the legitimacy of the military governments. In Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, public discourse had long been skeptical of international institutions. Many citizens felt abandoned when global bodies failed to halt insurgencies, failed to protect civilians, failed to hold Western powers accountable for interventions that destabilized the region. By rejecting the ICC, the juntas positioned themselves as defenders of national pride, not merely rulers who had seized power through coups. They reframed themselves as guardians of sovereignty, willing to defy global pressure on behalf of their people. But challenges loom. The insurgencies that plague the Sahel are unrelenting. Villages continue to be attacked, farmers fear their fields are mined, and schools remain shuttered by violence. In such conditions, the absence of international oversight raises concerns. Without the threat of external accountability, will military forces act with restraint? Will abuses against civilians go unchecked? Critics argue that the withdrawal may embolden armies to operate without consequence. Supporters counter that accountability must be built at home, not imposed from abroad. Here the figure of Ibrahim Traoré becomes emblematic. His rise through the coup of 2022, his fiery speeches about dignity and resistance, and now his role in this bold withdrawal have made him a symbol of defiance. For his supporters, the Ibrahim Traoré coup is not simply a military takeover. It is the genesis of a broader revolution that seeks to untangle Africa from the institutions of dependency. His critics warn that charisma cannot replace institutions, and that sovereignty without justice risks repeating the cycles of violence. This tension defines the moment. On one hand, the withdrawal restores agency to states that felt humiliated by double standards. On the other, it places enormous responsibility on fragile governments to deliver justice themselves. If they fail, their rebellion against the ICC could backfire, reinforcing stereotypes that Africans cannot govern or judge themselves. Beyond the borders of the Sahel, the withdrawal injected fresh energy into continental debates. In Nairobi and Addis Ababa, commentators speculated whether East African states might follow. In Johannesburg, the memory of South Africa's attempted withdrawal resurfaced. Across Africa, conversations about justice, sovereignty, and dignity flared once more. The Sahel's choice rekindled an old question. Is justice still credible when it flows only from the north to the south? For now, the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey echo with a sense of vindication. Citizens speak of reclaiming dignity, of refusing to be judged by courts that never touch Western leaders. Yet beneath the pride lies uncertainty. Can these governments deliver justice at home while fighting wars on multiple fronts? Can they construct mechanisms that balance sovereignty with fairness, accountability with resilience? The gamble is immense. For the Sahel, withdrawal was not an endpoint but a beginning. It was the tearing up of one script in order to attempt the writing of another. Whether that new script becomes a chronicle of resilience or of relapse depends on choices yet to be made. But sovereignty is never just about defense. It is about rewriting the future. Who else would stand with them? The echo of the Sahel's defiance reached far beyond their deserts. On the international stage, the withdrawal was interpreted not only as a legal rupture, but as a geopolitical statement. 3 of Africa's most embattled nations had drawn a line in the sand and dared the world to respond. The African Union's reaction carried particular weight. For years, the AU had criticized the ICC for targeting Africa disproportionately, with summit resolutions urging reform. While the Union stopped short of orchestrating a collective withdrawal, the Sahel Trio's move reignited debates within Addis Ababa. Some delegates argued that this was the natural culmination of long-standing grievances. Others worried about the vacuum left behind. If Africa rejected The Hague, what alternative mechanisms of justice could fill the void? In West Africa, the regional bloc ECOWAS faced an awkward dilemma. Traditionally aligned with Western partners on matters of security and governance, ECOWAS had already been at odds with the Sahel's military governments after their coups. Now with Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger united under the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, their withdrawal from the ICC deepened the rift. What began as disputes over electoral legitimacy was morphing into a contest over sovereignty itself. Europe's response was predictable. Brussels warned that abandoning the ICC undermined the rule of law and signaled a retreat into impunity. Paris, still smarting from its military expulsion from the Sahel, painted the move as evidence of juntas shielding themselves from accountability. Yet these arguments sounded hollow to many Africans who remembered that no French president had ever faced justice for colonial-era atrocities or for interventions in Libya and the Sahel. Washington's position was equally fraught. The United States had never ratified the Rome Statute, deliberately keeping itself beyond the court's jurisdiction. Still, American officials urged the Sahel states to reconsider, citing concerns for human rights. To African observers, this contradiction was glaring. The same nation that shielded its soldiers from scrutiny in Iraq and Afghanistan now lectured others on accountability. Outside the West, reactions were markedly different. Russia praised the withdrawal as an assertion of sovereignty and offered support for alternative African-led mechanisms. China remained cautious but reiterated its position that international justice must respect state sovereignty. Turkey and other emerging powers framed the move as part of a broader shift toward a multipolar world order in which Africa would no longer play by rules it did not write. In the streets of Ouagadougou and Bamako, these geopolitical debates translated into a sense of empowerment. Citizens celebrated not only a break from the ICC, but also a broader liberation from external dictates. The withdrawal was folded into the narrative of resistance that had already seen the expulsion of French troops and the embrace of new alliances. It is in this context that the Burkina Faso Revolution acquires meaning. The revolution is not only about one nation's trajectory, it has become a symbol of Africa's potential to redefine its relationship with the world, to say that sovereignty is not negotiable, that dignity is not conditional, that justice must not be outsourced. Yet questions remain unresolved. If the ICC is no longer legitimate in African eyes, what structures will take its place? Will the AU develop an African Court of Sovereign Justice, as some propose? Or will fragmented national efforts struggle to meet international standards? The international gaze is now fixed on the Sahel, waiting to see whether this rebellion becomes a continental movement or a cautionary tale. If Africa can break free from one court, what other chains can be broken? The withdrawal from the ICC was not an endpoint. It was a beginning. Having torn up one script, the Sahel nations now face the daunting challenge of writing another. If they refuse the court in The Hague, What will they build in its place? The juntas of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have framed their decision not as a retreat into impunity, but as a leap towards self-determined justice. They have invoked Africa's long traditions of dispute resolution, from councils of elders mediating conflicts, to Rwanda's Gakaka courts that processed more than 1 million cases after the genocide. These examples, however imperfect, prove that justice need not flow from Europe to be credible. It can grow from African soil itself. Across the Sahel, discussions are emerging about indigenous mechanisms adapted to modern realities. Hybrid courts could be established, blending professional judges with community leaders. Truth commissions might record testimonies in local languages, ensuring that victims' voices are heard directly rather than filtered through distant institutions. Reparations could take the form not only of money, but of rebuilding schools, restoring farmland, and reintegrating fighters through service to their communities. These ideas are ambitious, but they reflect a determination to craft justice rooted in culture and context rather than imported templates. At the same time, the Alliance of Sahel States is positioning itself not only as a military pact, but as a laboratory for sovereignty. The expulsion of French troops, the rejection of donor dependency, and now the ICC withdrawal all signal a broader project to demonstrate that dignity is possible without permission. Yet this path is fraught with risk. Indigenous systems require legitimacy, resources, and impartiality, 3 elements often fragile in conflict zones. Without careful design, the promise of self-determined justice could collapse into cycles of revenge. Still, the symbolism of this moment is undeniable. For decades, Africa has been told that accountability comes only from external courts. By choosing differently, the Sahel has dared to ask whether justice can be both African and universal. If they succeed, they may offer the continent a new model, an African court of sovereign justice under the African Union, designed not as a replica of The Hague, but as an institution blending modern law with African traditions of reconciliation. The stakes could not be higher. If the Sahel can prove that credible justice is possible without Western oversight, it will mark a profound shift in Africa's place in the global order. But if the experiment fails, critics will seize on it as evidence that sovereignty without supervision is chaos. But if justice no longer flows from Europe, can Africa truly trust its own soil to carry the weight? The September withdrawal was more than a legal announcement. It was a spark thrown into dry grass. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger did not simply leave the International Criminal Court. They challenged the very architecture of global justice. For decades, Africa had lived under the shadow of selective prosecutions. The powerful of the West walked free, while Africans were paraded in handcuffs. By stepping away, the Sahel states tore through that illusion and declared that their sovereignty was not negotiable. This act is not without peril. To reject an institution is easy. To build a credible alternative is infinitely harder. The burden now rests on the shoulders of governments already battered by insurgency and economic hardship. Yet in their defiance lies a chance to redefine what justice can mean. Not imported, not dictated, but rooted in the soil of Africa itself. It is a gamble that could either reinforce stereotypes of chaos or shatter them forever. Figures like Ibrahim Traoré embody this gamble. His coup in 2022 placed him at the center of a storm. Supporters hail him as the face of dignity, the voice that dares to confront hypocrisy. Critics accuse him of shielding himself and his comrades. The truth of history will depend not on slogans, but on whether he and his peers can transform rebellion into renewal. If they succeed, the Ibrahim Traoré coup will be remembered not as a seizure of power, but as the seed of a new order. The wider implications stretch beyond the Sahel. The Burkina Faso Revolution symbolizes more than one nation's defiance. It is a beacon for a continent wrestling with its place in the world. If 3 of the poorest countries on earth can defy The Hague without collapse, what might stronger African nations achieve if they, too, refuse to be bound by rules they did not write? The question now belongs not only to the leaders, but to the people. Justice must not vanish, it must evolve. And if Africa succeeds, it will no longer be a subject in the margins of global history. It will be an author of its own destiny. If one small landlocked nation can, what stops the rest? If this resonates with your sense of justice, subscribe and stand with the story.